Hey guys, welcome to the Grease Monkey channel, and in today's video we'll be going over duplication of objects and link duplication. This will be the first half of a simple linking tutorial. The next one should be about linking through project files. So let's get into it. Alright, so here we are in Blender 3.2, and before we get into the meat of this duplication linking tutorial, I just want to go over some key concepts to understand, to make this easier to understand in the long run. So we have our objects here. I got these objects from Texture Haven. You'll see in our outliner we have our cameras, our lights, and our blue barrel and our red barrel. On the left side you'll see of the names of the barrels, you'll see that there's a little icon, and that's a triangle that represents as an object data. Every type of object data has or object I should say, has an icon. So here we have lights, camera, and then we have the triangle for an object. So the first thing I want you to do is, instead of imagining this object as like the barrel, the object, I want you to imagine it like a folder, right? So in this folder, and imagine that icon being a folder, in this folder we have data. That data is a mesh data. So here's a mesh data, which is represented as a green triangle with the vertices at the end to represent the mesh data. And this mesh data is literally this. So this is being represented by this little section here, the little green triangle, mesh data. And then this data as a collective is called a mesh, right? And it's inside of a folder called barrel or blue barrel 1. Okay? So that's the same thing with this red barrel, and that's key to understand, right? So this object or this folder technically has two sets of data. So the data that's inside of it, right, which includes the mesh and the materials and the animation or anything else that is like an attribute of the object. And then the other set of data that it has, it's its own coordinates, right? So if you go into item, transform, this folder has these pieces of data, which is location, rotation, and scale. Okay, so that goes for both the red barrel and the blue barrel. Okay, so that's some basic stuff there. So let's start duplicating. Let's just try and get into this. So there's two ways to duplicate. If you right click and you hit duplicate, if you right click, you'll get the object context menu, and you'll see two options. You'll have duplicate objects and duplicate links. So let me go through them for you to understand what's happening here. So let's get this red barrel. And the first thing I'm going to do is do the first one. So right click, duplicate link. I'm going to hit Shift D. Shift D. So here it is, Shift D. I'll move it to the side. So let's see what happened here. So what happened here is that I duplicated the object, right? This folder is duplicated. And inside, I duplicated the mesh, right? So if we look at the list of meshes that are listed here, we have three meshes now. We have 001, which is the blue barrel, 000 and 002. You can already see how this gets kind of confusing, right? So what I like to do is I like to rename my mesh data appropriately. So I'll go to blue barrel, I'll copy that, I'll click on the mesh data, make sure I'm here, and then I'll name it the same as the object data, the folder name, right? So let's do that with the red barrel. I'm going to copy it, go here, paste. Okay, so now if we look at the list of meshes that we have in our project, when you click on this, you're looking at everything that's in this project file. Like, let's see, what are all my meshes in the project? You click on it, boom, we have the blue barrel mesh, not the object, the mesh, it's right here. We have the red barrel mesh, which is this one right here, and then we have this mesh that 002, right? So what's happening here is that this red barrel 001, and if I go to this second duplication, I rename this mesh to 002, for example. These are these have two sets of mesh. So all this data is being saved, and for the second barrel that we duplicated, all this data is being saved. So we have two sets of the same data. So thinking like in an optimal way, that's kind of like a waste of data. You have the same exact data. that's being duplicated, you're doing nothing different to it, and then you're taking up more space, more faces. This can duplicating this way can really bloat your file if you're just duplicating a lot of the same objects, right? Sometimes you want to do it this way. You do Shift D, because what you're gonna do is you're gonna go inside the edit and change the mesh somehow, because you do want this one to be different than the other one. Okay, so that's what Shift D does. You're duplicating. Okay, so one thing that I already see an issue with, right, is my naming scheme, right? So when I duplicated the red barrel _01 and I duplicated it, it added this .001, right? Because like, oh, it already exists, so let me increment it. So the way that Blender works is that when it increments something, it uses the .00, right? So to avoid all this to begin with, so you don't have to think about it too much, I'm gonna delete the second barrel that I made. I'm also going to delete the data, right? Because this data still exists. If we look at this mesh data, you can see that I have 3 even though I only have 2 objects. So you see that data still living in here, right? You can delete any extra data that's not being used, and be careful with this because you may not be using something but want it. You go to cleanup, and I use recursive unused data. See, and it says one data block is not being used, and it's the one mesh, and we know what that mesh is. It's the duplicated mesh, red barrel mesh. Boom, deleted, purged, gone. So there it is. So now we're back down to blue barrel and red barrel. So to avoid that like weird number scheme stuff, instead of naming your stuff red barrel _01, I'm gonna name it .00. The first one, it has to start from 0, so .000, and we'll do the same with this one. So we'll do .000, and we'll do the same things in the mesh. We'll do .000 and the mesh here, and we'll do .000. Okay, cool. So now what when we duplicate this red barrel, we'll do it again. Shift D. So this is just a complete copy. We're copying the whole thing. Shift D. You'll see that it'll increment to .001, and you can see that our mesh is now .001, and you can see that now we have a red barrel .000 and red barrel .001, right? So let's go back. So that's the first way of duplication, and just know that you're literally making a duplicate, and you can do whatever you want to the second duplicate, and it's not going to affect the first one because you're treating them as 2 separate objects. When you duplicate it this way, think of these as like these are 2 separate objects. This isn't a clone. It's a clone of the original, but you can change this one however you want, and it's not going to affect the first one, right? Because it doesn't matter, right? So let's go back. Let's say you're gonna have a lot of these barrels, and you don't want to bloat up your file. What if you had thousands of these, right? But they're all gonna look the same. They're all gonna be the same color, same texture, and things like that. And that's where the second duplication method comes, right? So if you right click and you hit duplicate linked, and the shortcut is Alt D. Alt D. Let's see what it does. Let's hit Alt D. We've duplicated it. So it duplicated the object, so it has to increment it, right? So it's like a new folder, but in that folder, we're sharing a data, and that data that's being shared is red barrel. Now, if we look at the list of barrels, look, we still only have 2 meshes, right? We have the red barrels and the blue barrels, right? And you're wondering like, okay, what's the point of this, right? So let's say we duplicate a bunch of these. We're going to do it with Alt D. So let me go to duplicate, Alt D, you know, Alt D. Okay, we have a bunch of barrels, right? Now this isn't taking up 6 times the space. Okay, this is taking up the amount of data this is using in your file is just one mesh data. So one set of, let's see how many vertices this is, 1,000 faces, you know, or you know, yeah, 1,000 verts, 1,300 faces. That's all that is. It's not 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. This is not 15,000 points. You know, this is just 3,000 points, or however many vertices it is. And this is how you can save space, especially when you're duplicating a lot of the similar objects, right? But what's interesting about these linked objects is, let's say you wanted them different size. Remember that I said that the object has two sets of data: what's inside of it, right? The barrels, mesh data, and also the location, rotation, and scale. And these could be different from each other, right? So if we go to the fourth barrel up here, you can actually make this one bigger. You know, you can actually stretch this on the z-axis, and so you have some limited ability on how to make this look different. You can rotate it, you can, you know, squish, and you can have it in different areas, right? So at least you have some flexibility with that if you need them to be in different places, right? So that's how it's linked. And let's say that, oh, you know, you get a no, or you're like, you know, instead of this red barrel having, you know, this to be smooth, you need it to stick out a little bit. So you can actually go in to the data, or to the object, and since it only has the red barrel mesh that's shared amongst all of them, you hit go to edit mode by hitting tab, and you could change up the mesh, and it'll affect the rest of them. So I'm gonna select these, I'm gonna hit I to like inset it, Alt E, and you can see that now all the barrels are gonna have this mesh, because we're sharing this data amongst all of them. And then you could do big sweeping changes onto all the objects, especially when the objects are supposed to be the same. Okay, so let's undo that. That's the first thing that's beneficial with linking. You're saving data, and if you affect one of the meshes, it affects all of them. Another thing you can do is, so this mesh attached to it is a material, right? So this blue mesh has this blue barrel mesh has blue barrel material that's attached to it. When I use this mesh, this material is gonna be carried along with it, right? So if I go into this barrel, right, and I go into the mesh data, and instead of, it's like, oh, don't use the red barrel anymore, use the blue barrel. Boom, we change it to the blue barrel. We can go here, we can change this one to the blue barrel, and it's just easy to change. So we changed it, and the material comes with it, right? And I bring that up, okay? I bring that up because you can actually have the material not come with the mesh and only come with the object. And let me explain what that means. So let's delete these. Let's go back to the original. We're gonna click on, let's say, the blue mesh. Let's go to materials. You can see that this material, right? Here's the material. And we have the material here. It's linked to the data. You see it right there. It says link material object or data, and then it says colon, and then you see the blue words, that's data. So that what this is saying is this material is attached to the mesh, so if it gets used somewhere else, this part of the data goes with it. But you can actually delete this, change this to object, right, and then put the blue barrel on the object, right? So now you can see the difference here. So this blue barrel has two sets of data, as it always did, but instead of it being like the red barrel where it's the mesh data, and then inside the mesh data is attached the material, we have it so this folder, the blue barrel, has the mesh data, and separately it has the blue barrel. Okay, so now watch. Now if I go to the red barrel and I change the mesh, you can see that the material does not come with it, right? I barely ever do it this way. I always have the material attached to the mesh, but I can see how you can need this if you have a procedural material that's going to be carried along with the object instead of the mesh. I mostly have the mesh. It's just something to be aware of on where your material can be. So let's put this back. We'll put it back on the data. Blue barrel. So let me expand this concept here. So let's say I open up let's say I put in a monkey, Suzanne, and you can see that this has a new mesh right here, Suzanne. But if I got Suzanne and I change this into a blue barrel, boom, I changed it to a blue barrel, right? So I can change objects. You can see how this folder says Suzanne, it says it's an object, but I changed it to a blue barrel. I just want you to understand that this is a folder that holds data. Okay, so that is the benefit of linking your objects, or duplicate link. What's it called here? Right click, duplicate linked instead of duplicate object. Okay, because if you, let me erase this, and if I click on the red barrel, we have the red barrel there. See, we have the Suzanne mesh still here, even though Suzanne is no longer in the outliner. If you see the 0 here, and from my understanding, the 0 means that it has 0 users. Nobody's using it in the outliner here, right? So what that means is that if I purge the data, or I save, close, and open, this mesh is gonna go away. But technically, it still exists in here, right? So I'll show you what I mean. I'm gonna let me save. And you see it right here. Still Suzanne right there. Zero users. Clean up, purge, unused data. One mesh. Now it's gone. Okay. So let's say that you have a mesh, or even material. This works for most things. So let's say you have Suzanne, you have the monkey, you're like, cool, I like it, you do a bunch of stuff to it or whatever, you know, this is how I want it. But I don't need it right now. I'm gonna need it later. I'm gonna need this mesh later. You can obviously put it in a collection and close it down. But what you could do is you can force a user, right? So that's this little shield here. What's it called? Fake user, not force user. Fake user. Save this data block even if it has no users. So if I select this, now has a little check mark. I delete Suzanne from the outliner. I look for the mesh. You can see that Suzanne now has an F next to it, which means it's forced. So now if I purge the data, it shouldn't erase. It says no orphan data blocks to purge, even though Suzanne's not being used, but that's because it has this little shield here to force it there, right? So let's uncheck mark that. And I'm going to delete it. Okay, so let's go through a few more examples on how this is useful. And I think you got it. I think you'll be able to fully get it. So let's go to the red barrel here. I see that I have a plane and Suzanne's still here. So let me purge that real quick. Purged. Okay. So let's say you have a lot of barrels. I mean, I'm going to do Alt-D, not Shift-D. Alt-D, so I'm going to link all these. These are all going to be linked. All right. And I specifically want this barrel right here to be different than the rest of the barrels, right? So if you see in our mesh data, you see this little number here. That's showing you, it says display number of users of this data. 4 of these objects are using this mesh data, right? So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's say I want this guy to have the inset, right? Like the inset, and then we extrude it out. But I don't want the rest of them to have it, right? The first thing to do is you can make this like a single user copy, right? So what you're doing is that these are all using the same mesh data, but you want this one to be its own unique data. So you click on the number, boom, you see red barrel.001. You see that now there's 2 red barrels. You can call this one, you know, he's our main one, our main red barrel. Now when you go in here and you change the data, you can see that this goes out like that, and now we changed it. Okay, so that's one thing you can do when you're linking and you only need one to be changed. And just know that when you're combining objects as well, you're just combining it all into the same mesh data. So let me go back here. There we go, back to doing that. So let's say we take all these and we hit Control J. All you're doing is getting the mesh data and putting all that mesh data into this data, right? So now when I hit Shift D, you know, that's why it's duplicating all that data. Okay. So let's undo that. Okay, another thing you can do, okay, is not only do this with objects. So let's say we have some lights up here. Let's get this light. Let's make it into something more visible. We'll change it into a area light. We're gonna move the rotation here. We'll move the size. We'll do this one by one, right? And we'll call this light. So let's say you have like a bunch of lights that are going to be the same, like in a building on a ceiling or something. So you could hit Shift D, right? And you'll have two separate light data. Look, it's the same thing here. We have the different light data here. But if you link it instead, right? You hit D here on the Y. We'll duplicate this, Alt D, we'll do it on the Y. Now you have 4 of the same light data, and you can change all the lights at the same time, so they're all the same color. It's hard to see here. So yeah, so you have all these lights. If you just change one, you're like, oh, I want them all to be weaker. So it's the duplicate. This helps a lot with lights as well. So you have the lights, they all turn green, they all turn a different color. A bonus tip here for like duplication of objects. Let's say that you have these 4 lights, but you want to spread these out further. What you could do is you can hit Shift S, go to cursor to selected, so it goes to this selected one. Select all of these. Go to options here and do locations, right? Now what it's going to do is, instead of scaling it, the light itself, it's going to scale it from the location point. So let's hit the period key, let's go to 3D cursor, and we'll hit S, and you can see we can scale these out, right? This may be hard to understand or see, so I'm going to do it again, but not with the lights. So let's erase these lights. Let's put this back to a point light and put it back to 100. Put it to white light again. Let's do 200, 300. Okay. So let's go here. Alright, so I'm going to make a group of these. So I'm going to Alt D and just select all of these. Alt D. I'm going to select all these. Alt D, we'll rotate them. Let me take this off for now just to show you how this works. There we go. Alt D. Alt D, right? So we have all these barrels that are only using one mesh data. Look at that. 12 of them are being used. So saving on space here. And this is primarily for saving data space and not necessarily performance. A lot of the performance on Eevee from my testing comes from the amount of shadows you have, how many lights you have that are producing shadow, and that's really from my testing. I have to do a little bit more testing. Let's erase this blue barrel. Okay, so here we have all these barrels. Let's say I want them either A, closer together, or further apart. So you can actually select all these guys, go to these options, select location, and then when you hit scale, it doesn't scale the objects, it scales their location, right? I think this is just a neat trick that I'm gonna add in here for you to know, right? Boom, scale. You can even rotate these. It doesn't look like much, but they're rotating in a different way. I think scale is the best one. So you're like, ooh, let's scale these. Okay, these guys are a little too close. Let's scale these apart. Boom, let's scale these apart. Boom, let's rotate them. These are touching. Let's scale these apart. And then you gotta remember to take this off. And then there you go. Because like if you were to select all of these, let's do it without that option on. You'll see that the barrels just get bigger. The barrels get smaller. The barrels get bigger. With this, you spread them apart, you put them together, and you can really start like affecting the objects better. All right, so hopefully that helps you out. to understanding the difference between like duplicating objects and duplicating linked, what their benefits are. I hope you learned something good. And if you have any suggestions for duplication or something that I missed, I'm going to leave a pinned comment down below. Just add it to that pinned comment to help out the next Blender user. And I will see you guys on the next one.